Good evening and welcome. My name is Jonathan Elkind. I'm a fellow and senior research scholar here at the Center on Global Energy Policy. I am very pleased to have you all here with us tonight for what promises to be a fantastic discussion of climate change and the possibility of solutions for climate change, particularly in today's Washington with all the complexity that entails. Finding solutions for climate change, of course, is never easy. That is so because the emissions that are warming our globe result from so many different features of contemporary life: our lighting, our heating, our cooling, the way that we power our industry, how we move goods and people, how we grow crops and what we eat, how we use the land, and how we design human settlements. To respond effectively, we need solutions that fuse three different attributes at least: speed, scale, and durability. Because it's not sufficient to dream up responses that address only one or two of these considerations. We need all three in order to succeed in responding to climate change. And just in case we thought that wasn't complicated enough, then we have the question of our politics in the current day, which is certainly an additional degree of difficulty. If this were the Olympics, it would be scored pretty high. Tonight's program seeks to drill into the question of whether there are viable solutions to the politics of climate change. Can we find politically saleable solutions that allow us to move quickly enough and confront the broad scope of greenhouse gas emissions and put in place solutions that can be sustained out into the future without being rolled back or removed? So for this purpose, we have a truly outstanding program. We will have keynote remarks from the Honorable Carlos Curbelo, a distinguished visiting fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy, and until recently, the member of Congress representing this 26th district in Florida. Then we will have a panel discussion involving Congressman Curbelo and the three outstanding experts who are to his right. I'll introduce them shortly. Let me note at the outset that this program tonight is on the record, and like all of the Center's public events, it is being live streamed. Audience members, both those of you who are here in the room tonight and those of you who are sitting at your desks, sorry about that, or sitting at home, you may at any point pose questions using the hashtag CGEP events and our Twitter handle, which is @ColumbiaUEnergy. Again, for questions, it's hashtag CGEP events and our Twitter handle, which is @ColumbiaUEnergy. So I've started with a bang, more military precision about the timing than I normally would, because we have such a great collection of people to speak with you this evening. We will be kicked off by the Honorable Carlos Curbelo. Prior to joining in the capacity that I mentioned a moment ago, Congressman Curbelo was, as I said, the member of Congress for Florida's 26th district, serving 2 terms. He served on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, the Education and Workforce Committee, the Small Business Committee, and the powerful Committee on Ways and Means, where he co-authored the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017. Carlos Curbelo also co-founded and co-chaired the bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus, and he served in a leadership role in the Problem Solvers Caucus and led the Brazil Caucus to strengthen the relationship with Latin America's leading economy. Of particular note for tonight's program, he introduced the Market Choice Act, legislation that would invest nearly $1 trillion in American infrastructure while reducing greenhouse gas emissions through a price on carbon. He has a bachelor's degree from the University of Miami and a master's degree in public administration. To his right, Kristina Costa is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where she focuses on domestic and international climate change and energy policy. Prior to joining CAP, Kristina served as the legislative assistant for energy and environment for Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer. Kristina was also a policy advisor and speechwriter on the Hillary for America campaign and worked previously in the Obama White House as advisor to the counselor to the president, working on implementation of all aspects of President Obama's climate action plan. She holds a bachelor's from Wellesley College. To her right is Rhiana Gunn-Wright, who is the policy director of the Green New Deal project at New Consensus, a Chicago-based policy organization. Ms. Gunn-Wright was previously the policy director for the 2018 gubernatorial campaign of Dr. Abdul al-Said in Michigan. A 2013 Rhodes Scholar, Rhiana has also worked as the policy analyst for the Detroit Health Department, the Mariam K. Chamberlain Fellow of Women and Public Policy at the Institute for Women's Policy Research, and on the policy team for the former First Lady, Michelle Obama. She graduated cum laude from Yale in 2011 with majors in African American Studies and Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Last but not least is Alex Flint, who's Executive Director for the Alliance for Market Solutions, an organization of conservative leaders addressing two top priority challenges: the need to reduce carbon pollution and to grow the economy. Alex is an experienced and prominent lobbyist, having led the Nuclear Energy Institute's advocacy program as the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for a decade before joining AMS in May of last year. He previously served as staff director of the U.S. Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, during which he led the creation of the Bipartisan Energy Policy Act of 2005, the first significant energy legislation in 13 years. He received a bachelor's degree in international politics from George Washington University. So with that, I will, in just a moment, ask Congressman Curbelo to take the podium for his presentation. Let me again remind you that audience members are both those in the House and at home or elsewhere are invited to submit questions using the hashtag CGEP events and our Twitter handle at Columbia U Energy. Congressman, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and I want to begin tonight by thanking Columbia University and the Center for Global Energy Policy for bringing us all together to have this important discussion, and then personally for affording me the opportunity to continue my work on climate policy that started in the U.S. House of Representatives. A lot of people ask me what I miss about Congress. There's a lot I don't miss, and if we take a look at how this year started, it's obvious why. But I do miss the fact that in Congress, if you serve to the fullest, if you make the most out of every day, you know you're making a difference. You know you're doing relevant work. You know you're contributing to the future of your community, your country, and hopefully the world. And this opportunity at Columbia certainly gives me the opportunity to continue doing this relevant and important work, to continue contributing to this important question of how we are going to start healing our planet and start reversing some of the damage that has been done. In that same vein, I want to thank the Alliance for Market Solutions, my friends and colleagues, Jeff Williams and Alex Flint, who are here, because through that organization, I'm also continuing this important work, as well as the Nature Conservancy, the Florida chapter there, where we're more specifically working on issues that are unique to the state of Florida. A lot of people ask me, how did you get involved with this issue? Why did you get involved? And I think when people ask that question, they expect a very interesting story. Not the case. I did not have an epiphany. I did not have a dream. I certainly, through conversations with friends before I got elected to Congress. And then after meeting with many experts and doing my own research, came to the conclusion that this is one of the great challenges of our time, of my generation, that it was specifically important for my community in South Florida, a community where most people live at about sea level and very close to the sea, that this was a local issue for us that needed to be addressed. I quickly came to realize that there's a real cost to carbon pollution. And I know this because in South Florida, for example, the city of Miami Beach has invested hundreds of millions of dollars in sophisticated pump systems to deal with chronic tidal flooding. In the Florida Keys, the local government there is already investing in elevating roads. City of Miami residents approved a $200 million bond referendum to make coastal infrastructure stronger. So there is a cost, and we are paying it already. It just isn't evident, unfortunately, to a lot of people. Something else that really solidified my commitment to this cause was a 2015 Earth Day trip on Air Force One from Washington, D.C. to Miami and then the Everglades via Marine One. A lot of people are curious about Air Force One travel. I'll just give you this insight. I was once with President Obama on Air Force One and twice with President Trump on Air Force One, and this is the best metaphor I could come up with. The Obama Air Force One was like being in the library of a liberal think tank. Very quiet. You didn't really feel comfortable walking around because you didn't know where you were supposed to go and where you weren't supposed to go. People didn't speak in a very loud voice. It was a pleasant experience. The Trump Air Force One is like the government version of a party bus in the sky. Loud, chaotic, all the televisions on, and I'll just call it an interesting experience. On all of those trips, I was actually able to raise the issue of climate change with each president and with members of White House staff, and as you can imagine, I got very different answers. But back to the important work that we started in Congress and that hopefully will continue in this 116th Congress. After realizing that this was an important issue that really merited my attention and my efforts, I noticed that we were at a place where we really didn't know how we could start working together. For 20 plus years, this issue has been highly polarized. It's been very difficult to even have a dialogue and a conversation. So that's why my Florida colleague, Ted Deutsch, and I decided to create the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus. This was a place where Republicans and Democrats would come together, put aside all the rhetoric, put aside all the noise, focus on the science and the facts, and begin an honest, sincere, constructive dialogue on how we could develop solutions to meet this critical challenge. And really, we envisioned 3 phases for the caucus. The first phase was to depoliticize the issue, to get that conversation started. And the structure of the caucus really contributed to that goal. We established the caucus under a Noah's Ark rule. That means that if you wanted to join, you could only join if a member of the opposing party joined with you. So what did that cause? Countless intimate, personal, genuine conversations between members of Congress, usually Democrats inviting Republicans to join with them and explaining why it was important. A lot of those Republicans who would get asked would then come to me and ask me, hey, what's this caucus all about? What are you doing? Is this some kind of trap? And of course, my answer was no. This is just an opportunity to have a good discussion, to learn about this issue, and hopefully to build some trust across the aisle. We were successful in establishing that dialogue. When I arrived in Congress, there were maybe 3 or 4 House Republicans who were willing to acknowledge this issue, who are willing to talk about it, who are willing to use the term climate change. By the time I finished my work in Congress just a few weeks ago, there were 45 Republicans who had signed their names to this caucus, acknowledged climate change as a real threat, and equally as important, acknowledged that the government had a role in addressing this significant challenge. So we did establish that dialogue, and we did bring a lot of Republicans forward. The second phase of the effort would be that the caucus would come together to oppose anti-climate policy, and we were able to do that successfully as well. For the first time under Republican leadership of the House defeated an anti-climate amendment filed by a Republican member. This was a member that wanted to prohibit the Department of Defense from assessing the risks to its facilities tied directly to climate change. This is the part of the effort by many conservatives to erase this idea from people's minds and obviously from government policy. We came together and the caucus voted almost unanimously. I think the one person who voted the other way made a mistake to bring down that amendment. It was another historic moment in the U.S. House of Representatives. And then the final phase, or the most important phase of the caucus, which I hope the colleagues who I have left behind and many new members of the 116th Congress will come together to pursue, is the idea that this caucus become an ideas factory and that it generates policy that Republicans and Democrats can get behind to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, help heal the planet, and help coastal communities that are the ones most exposed for now to the impacts of climate change. What I learned as I worked through all of this over the course of 4 years is that if we are going to get durable, meaningful climate policy in this country, it must be bipartisan in nature. Otherwise, it will be very difficult. Not impossible, but very difficult. Some friends want to hold out until the Democratic Party controls at least 60 seats in the Senate, a majority in the House, and controls the White House as well. What I would offer to my friends is that that happened 10 years ago, and we got absolutely nothing. That's why my bet is on continuing to depoliticize, depolarize this issue, educating Republican members of the House, and taking advantage of an issue that I'm sure we'll discuss extensively as part of the panel portion of the program, the energy that the Green New Deal is creating around the topic of climate change is so important. It's valuable. It has pushed this issue to the top of the national agenda. On December 30th, I was on a Meet the Press show that was entirely dedicated to the issue of climate change. It's the first time ever that a Sunday show is entirely dedicated to this issue. And most importantly, we weren't discussing the so-called debate about climate change, because the only debate should be about the solutions, not about the reality. We were covering the story, what's happening around the country, and what might be possible in the 116th Congress. So I truly hope that Republicans will gain the courage and have the sincerity and the frankness to approach this issue in a constructive way, as we started doing during my time in Congress, and that Democrats will be willing to come to a table, that the concept of the Green New Deal generate enthusiasm and strength and energy for this movement, but not the type of fanaticism that we have seen in our politics that has prevented solutions from proceeding. So again, my profound gratitude to Columbia, to Jason Bordoff, to everyone at the Center for Global Energy Policy, and my profound gratitude for all of you, caring students and citizens who are coming together to be part of this dialogue, of this discussion that is so important to the future of our country and to the world. Let us begin. Thank you.
Congressman, thank you for starting us off so well with those remarks. I am going to kick off this panel discussion, and I will remind the members of the panel that you are very much encouraged to engage with each other, react to each other, offer further thoughts. That's kind of the name of the game, and it'll make sure that people in the audience don't feel the desire to go into hibernation. Let me remind those both here in the hall and those elsewhere that you can submit questions at any time using the hashtag CGEP events and our Twitter handle @ColumbiaUEnergy. So let me start with one of the questions that is I think a core thread of discussion very often about what our climate solutions can look like. And that is the role of fossil fuels going forward. Some policy prescriptions call for phase out eventually, phase out by date certain. Others are silent or agnostic on this. How long will fossil fuels be part of our future? How long should they be part of our future? Can I get a volunteer from the panel to kick us off on that one? Alex Flint, you are that volunteer.
I'm always willing to take on a difficult issue. I think that it is very important that as we approach that issue that we do it globally. Right? The issue is not when is there a cessation of the use of fossil fuel. The real question is what are the annual emissions rates of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and we have to think about it from a global perspective. So what I would suggest is that rather than discuss a deadline for fossil fuel use in the United States, we need to be thinking about policies in the United States that will incentivize the use of low greenhouse gas emissions technologies that can then be a model for and incentivize the rest of the world to follow suit. That's the way you actually address global climate change. I can't tell you what that year is going to be because I don't know at what rate we're going to develop new technologies. I don't understand the economics of those new technologies, and I certainly don't understand the rate at which they're going to be deployed around the world. But that's the real question. It's not what's the year, but how do we get to that point, which is most important.
Great, thank you for that. I'm looking to others. Kristina, you've made the fateful error of reaching for the mic, so please.
Sure, why not? So, I mean, building a little bit on what Alex says, I think often in the United States, and particularly in the political debate in the United States over what to do about climate change, the topic of fossil fuels tends to be confined a little bit to the energy sector. And that's just one place where fossil fuels play a role in how we power our economy. And I think what we're seeing, not just in the United States, but globally, is that actually the harder places in some ways to get fossil fuels out of the system are in transportation, in industrial uses that require extremely high heat for things like making steel, making cement, that is simply just very hard to electrify. And, you know, I think actually some of the protests that we saw in France over the increase in the gas tax there, that President Macron was trying to frame as a climate issue, while putting a lot of the revenue toward paying down their deficit, it has to be noted, you know, shows exactly how difficult and sticky some of these non-electric sector parts of the economy can be to decarbonize. I think, you know, the important thing is that we frame economy-wide climate policies around science-based targets, which in the United States, in the IPCC, have been framed around achieving net zero emissions by mid-century for quite some time. And I think, you know, the Obama administration, we tried very hard to get on in the Paris commitment, in our commitment in the Paris Agreement, to get the United States economy at least on the right track to achieving that. Unfortunately, as we've seen in the most recent emissions projections for the U.S. economy, not only is the Trump administration stopping us, we are in fact backsliding.
Rhiana, please, I hope you all will jump in more than wait for, you know, please.
For sure. I mean, I think the goal has to be build for a world without fossil fuels, right? Like that has to be the goal. We know what fossil fuels do, right? And they're not going to not do that anymore, right? Now, how you do that, I think, is a very important And I think loaded question, but I think it's most important to keep the goal in mind, which is a world without fossil fuels. And so I think two things I think of when it comes to fossil fuels is, one, how do you phase them out in a way that is responsible, right? But also pushes towards new technologies, right? And new sources of fuel because we know they exist, right? And like Kristina said, different sectors are different, but in energy, you could do almost 100% clean energy now. I said clean, not renewable, right? And then transportation, about 50% of the way there. We have the technology for light duty vehicles, not for, aviation, shipping, heavy duty transport, long transport. And then industry, like Kristina mentioned, we have very far to go. And so I think that should inform how and where we phase out things. Because the thing is, we want to phase it out in a way that pushes towards new technology, not that props it up for as long as possible, right? And those are two different outcomes that can come out of phasing out something, right? And so I think that is incredibly important to keep in mind. And then I think that it's important to, as you think about phasing out fossil fuels, to think about where are the places where it likely needs to stick around the longest, and how do we offset that so that we are at net zero, right? Because we're not going to flip a switch and there's no fossil fuels tomorrow, obviously. But I think it's important in figuring out that we don't get caught up in figuring out, not how to phase them out, but the question of whether they should be phased out or not, but have a clear goal and a clear stake in the ground, which is that we need to build an economy and a world that is not reliant on them anymore. Point blank and period.
Congressman, please.
So I think there's a great deal of consensus here. Look, it's obvious that we're moving gradually towards cleaner energy. We're already seeing natural gas emerge as that transition fossil fuel between the old fossil fuel heavy economy and the new clean energy economy of the future. I think the important question here is, whenever the date is that we reach net zero carbon emissions, how can we accelerate that? How can we make that date arrive sooner? And those are the types of solutions that we spent time working on in the Congress, and that I'm still spending time working on with Columbia, with the Alliance for Market Solutions, and for others. And I don't mean to steer the conversation in any one direction, but my personal view is that the best way to accelerate that, and if there's a panacea for this question, it is to just price carbon and allow the market to take care of the rest.
So go ahead, please.
Oh, I was going to say, I think the other thing that always needs to be included in a discussion of phasing out fossil fuels is how do we build up what will replace them, right? Because I think it's not enough to just say we have to get rid of fossil fuels, but how are we investing in renewables? How are we investing in biofuels, right, that are carbon neutral in places where we're not sure you can electrify, right? So that at least there's a stopgap until you can fully electrify. So I think that with a conversation about where fossil fuels fit in, there's always needs to be a conversation about what is coming next, what will be the replacement, and how do we invest in that heavily in a targeted way, in a way that's going to speed up the transition and not slow it down or keep it at the current pace.
So, I mean, implicit in this round of comments, I think, is a really important, really hard question about what the role of government policy is and ought to be. Alex, you framed it as put the conditions in place that will drive a transition. Rhiana, I hear a different edge to what you're talking about, which is more technology specific. And I want to kind of draw this out a little bit more, and comments from others, from everybody on the panel. What should the role of government policy be? What are the risks, either in terms of transition too slow or hasty decisions about transition that then prove to be less than opportune later? How do you score those risks between a too intrusive role of government and a not intrusive enough, because this issue is kind of deemed by a lot of our political system to be over the horizon, kind of tomorrow's problem. Kristina, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Well, I think, Jonathan, you made a very valuable point as you were introducing this event, which is that climate policy needs speed, it needs scale, and it needs durability. And I think what we've seen since the end of the Obama administration and the beginning of the Trump administration is that the federal government does play a very important role in this country in driving down emissions economy-wide. There's a number of, a bipartisan group of governors who have said, we're still into Paris, we are going to keep pushing as hard as we can, and yet emissions went up last year for the first time in many, many years. The Trump administration has been aggressively moving to not just roll back regulatory policies that were put in place, but also to roll back important investments in clean energy technologies coming out of places like ARPA-E, coming out of the Department of Energy. And I do have to respectfully quibble a little bit with something that Congressman Curbelo said in his remarks. I wouldn't be a good former Obama administration staffer if I didn't, which is that we did get quite a lot when Democrats had control of both chambers of Congress and the presidency. The Recovery Act, the bill to save the economy from the Great Recession, contained the single biggest investment in clean energy technologies in American history. It was on the scale of 80 or 90 billion dollars. We'd never done anything like that before. We got the Paris Climate Agreement, the first ever global agreement with all of the world's nations committing that they were part of the problem and needed to be part of the solution. A lesser known international agreement, the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, to phase down super polluting HFCs, which, if fully implemented worldwide, would avert half a degree of warming before the end of the century. And that's something that actually 13 Senate Republicans wrote to President Trump and said, send that up. We want to ratify it. We want the United States to be part of this deal. So I think there is an enormously important role for the federal government, but there's also an important role for state governments. There's an important role for city governments. There's a hugely important role for the business community. The fact of the matter is that this is a global crisis. We are all in it together, and we have to use every tool that we have.
So speaking as another Obama alum, let me, for devil's advocate purposes, argue a little bit with my colleague. All those things I agree with, as you will not be surprised. But what the Obama years didn't end with was that security and solidity about the durability of solutions, right? And so this is also a piece of the question that I'm posing about the role of government. Alex, why don't you please?
So I think you in your opening comments addressed two issues that are very relevant here. One is scale and the other is durability. Last year, globally, $1.8 trillion was invested in energy production and distribution. That's the scale of annual investment in the energy sector. We have to come up with a solution that can work at that level. And the bottom line is the investments made by the U.S. government are too small to have transformed the energy economy to date. And my contention is that the U.S. government doesn't have sufficient resources to transform an economy that's investing $1.8 trillion a year. And that if we attempt to do it through regulations, we will impose unnecessary costs and have the less efficient possible solution set. Because we have to make sure that whatever we do to achieve our goals, we do it as efficiently as possible. Otherwise, we don't have the resources to get there. If we instead create
Talk a little bit more about that, please, because I think that's
Right.
an issue that sometimes bounces off. What does that mean, efficient solutions? And why should somebody who is concerned about the need for speed
Right.
also care about the need for efficiency?
Because we should be reducing carbon from the economy where it is most economic to do so first. And then as we advance our carbon reductions, we should do so in accordance with the cost. There's no point in driving greenhouse gas emissions out of the economy at a high cost if we can do it less expensively elsewhere in the economy. That's why we talk about economy-wide. Let's compare the savings we can achieve in the transportation sector to the utility sector to the industrial sector to the home sector. We don't care where the greenhouse gas emissions come from. let's reduce them at the lowest possible cost. That's why we like the efficiency of a carbon tax, of creating a marketplace that incentivizes this behavior first throughout the U.S. economy. The other issue is we have to make sure that the U.S. economy remains robust. So to the extent to which we want to limit choices in the marketplace to encourage one sort of energy use, we need to make sure that we don't so hamper the economy that we can't afford to make those investments. It's another reason we need to look at what's the most efficient way of achieving these objectives.
Carlos, please.
Yeah, and I just want to make clear, I certainly appreciate the administration's efforts, and a lot was achieved. When I said nothing was achieved, I meant in the context of a comprehensive, durable solution. In other words, making law. And that's where I think the only way forward is with bipartisan buy-in, because even with 60 Democratic votes in the Senate, that kind of global, comprehensive, durable solution was not attainable. So I didn't in no way meant to diminish the administration's energy and environmental agenda. I supported much of it during its last 2 years. I just think we need to be realistic about the type of solution we need, which is a permanent solution, and how we could possibly achieve that solution given what we can anticipate the composition of Congress to be for the next 4, 6, 8 years.
Please.
Yeah. So I mean, I'll be honest. I think government has to lead on this. I think there's just no other body that has access to change laws, has access to financing, and also has agencies and people positioned to look across the economy, right, the way that the government does. That is not to say that markets don't have a role, right? Not at all. But I think there is something to say about constantly moving at the speed of the market and where that has gotten us, right? I just think that that's an important thing to think about, right, and to acknowledge. And the other thing that I'll say is that I think a lot of the energy around the Green New Deal and why people find it so exciting is that it's trying to address, obviously, climate change, but it's also very investment focused and thinking about if we have to change the way that we get energy, the way that we distribute energy, the way that we consume energy, why not do it in a way that positions us well, right, for a clean energy space and time, and in a way that grows jobs? Because I want to keep the U.S. economy robust too, but honestly, who is it robust for now?
So we're going to come back, Rhiana, to the some of the different pieces of Green New Deal in a minute. But yeah, I want to ask you, though, to engage on the point that Alex made about the scale of resources available. You said government should lead, but what does that mean? Because I mean, surely one thing, if you look at the speed at which companies will move when they feel that there is a commercial opportunity, they'll move really fast.
Yeah.
So what is the interplay between the leadership you want to see from government and Alex's point that you need the scale that comes from private financial flows?
I mean, I think the way that I engage with that is two things. I think companies do move when there's a commercial opportunity, but government plays a role in creating that commercial opportunity, right? We have the CEO of Chrysler asking essentially for more climate policy because they are not going to move into electric cars the way that they would if they don't know what the landscape is going to be. And so I think that the government, the way that we've been doing it right now, actually creates a lot of uncertainty in the landscape that does actually keep private capital from being invested and private companies from moving in the ways that I think sometimes that they want to move and that we need them to move. So I think that that is one thing. I think that obviously private investment has a role, but I also think that we have to be honest about the way that capital is moving, right, and what it's being used for and the ways that it's used. And so, for instance, moving into a completely green economy is going to take a lot of investments in technology, right? Some of these technologies will take a long time, right? And what we know is that private companies often, or like private equity, let's say, doesn't like to get in on investments that don't have a guarantee, when that guarantee might not be seen. And we've seen that government does pick up that slack in doing that initial investment. We've seen it in DARPA really successfully, and ARPA-E is trying to recreate that. And so I think government investment, particularly at the beginning, has a role. And the idea for DARPA and ARPA-E is that those things get commercialized, right? They don't live with the government, but in fact, the government does have a role in pushing that.
So does that mean
forward.
that a carbon tax should be a part of the Green New Deal?
It can, absolutely, right?
Do you think there'll be support for that among the kind of the most ardent proponents of Green New Deal?
I think there's a lot of proponents for a Green New Deal, and in fact, people are split. A lot of people are quite passionate about a carbon tax. A lot of people aren't. And I think the issue with carbon pricing and tax in particular comes down to design, right? A lot of the people who are against it are the places that when there's cap and trade, they become the hot spots. They suffer through the pollution, right? And that is why they don't want it, right? But if there are ways to design carbon tax, right, so that we can alleviate some of those pain points, I think that you'll see that. But I think there is an open question about if you're going to change the economy in the sort of scale and speed and scope that the Green New Deal is aiming for, does the role of the carbon tax become bigger or smaller, right? Because it's happening in the context of lots of other investments.
I have a question that I think I want to start off by posing to Congressman Curbelo and to Alex Flint, which goes to some of the conversations around the role of innovation and government involvement in innovation. I think there are some on the right side of the aisle who look to innovation as kind of the solution on climate. I'd be interested in your comment on that, how you view the role of innovation. Also, where should government engage in relation to clean energy innovation? Exclusively at a very early pre-commercial stage, or also as through programs that incent deployment of new clean energy technologies? How do you see the role of innovation and when government should engage on that?
So when we were building out the Market Choice Act, which was a carbon pricing legislation, we dedicated a significant line item to research and development because we do think the government should do a lot more than is being done today to support efforts at universities, at other private institutions, to develop the technologies that can help or could help us solve this question. Obviously, we're thinking about concepts like carbon capture, but even others that we cannot begin to imagine today. Power storage is obviously a major area of interest. The government should be investing significant resources into technological firms, universities, other institutes that are dedicating a lot of time and effort to coming up with the technologies that, number one, could help parts of the country like Miami adapt to a changing climate, and obviously, number two, that could help us strengthen current mitigation efforts. So certainly, I think that must be a major component, which is why we dedicated a significant line item to it when we were drafting our legislation.
So today's actually a very interesting day on this subject of Republicans in innovation. I was reading the press reports on the way up here this afternoon. There were climate hearings in the Congress today. And the E&E article starts that there was a surprising shift in what Republicans are saying in those hearings today from what they said years ago in previous hearings, because they are acknowledging climate change. Right? That transition has occurred. And from our meetings with Republican members of Congress, we have seen that. We don't debate science with Republicans anymore. What we do is we have a rather extended conversation about, as Republicans, what are we going to do about this now that we acknowledge we need to do something about climate change? And that's where innovation has become the topic of the day. Republicans recognize that we have to have innovation. The question now is, how do we incentivize that innovation? And that's where, and you'll see this, I suspect, and Congressman, you might comment on this. I think you're going to see that evolve more publicly with Republicans. Some of them supporting innovation legislation that may have incentives for certain technologies, and others moving towards creating markets through a carbon tax. I think that's where the real conversation is among Republicans right now, is what's the best way to achieve the innovation that we need. And I think Republicans are going to become more comfortable talking about that in public, like you saw at the hearings today. And our view is that the durability and the efficiency of a carbon tax is going to be very attractive to it. And what I hope, frankly, is that the politics of climate change aren't used as a weapon, that there's enough of an effort to be understanding and reach some sort of consensus that we can get to the point where these things will be on the table and we can have a discussion about what's the best way to achieve the shared goals.
Great. I want to do one last question, and then we already have our first Twitter question that's come in, and so after that I'll open up for questions from the floor. The last question goes to another one of the challenging aspects around the climate transition. It's baked in as one of the standard elements that one hears about in the Green New Deal context, but it's also talked about a lot, I think, by different people looking at the risks of change, the risks of doing the right thing for the climate, and that is that some communities, some parts of the workforce get left behind. Often people are using the term these days, the just transition. What role should national policy play in trying to steer toward a just transition, which I will define in the following way, but please define it differently if you see fit. A policy that does not leave people and communities that are in yesterday's technology spaces kind of out in the cold on their own. So what's the right role for government in dealing with this objective of a just transition?
So I gave a lot of thought to this while we were building out our legislation, because obviously those who are of lower incomes will obviously face the greatest challenges if we implement something like carbon pricing. So we really dedicated a lot of time to figuring out how we could be as sensitive as possible to those Americans who would struggle the most. That's why in our legislation we repealed the gasoline tax as part of the creation of a new carbon tax. Why? Well, because we know that lower income Americans tend to drive vehicles that are less fuel efficient. We know a lot of Americans who live in rural parts of the country are particularly sensitive to price increases at the gas pump. We also had a dividend component for the lowest quintile of households in terms of income. So those households would actually be better off after receiving the dividend as a result of the imposition of carbon pricing. A lot of Americans travel to visit their families by air. We repealed the jet fuel excise tax because we didn't want increases in airfare, again, to punish and to eliminate the possibility of lower income Americans traveling, whether to visit families or to go on vacation. And then, of course, a cohort, a group that gets discussed a lot is those who work in the coal industry, especially miners. And under our legislation, those individuals could essentially retire, and they would be made whole, so to speak, for life, or they could participate in job training programs if they wanted to work in other sectors or in renewables, for example. So this is probably the most important part because it's about people, and any policymaker who in any way makes it seem as people are expendable, or if in any way says something like, well, there are just consequences and we need to do this to save the planet, that's the surest way that you will lose millions of Americans who are economically strained today and who will be very worried about what their futures might look like. So this is one of the key questions in any environmental policy that we seek to adopt in order to mitigate carbon dioxide emissions.
So I think that one of the things that's actually most exciting about the conversation that's happening right now about the Green New Deal is the degree to which many of the advocates are putting issues of job quality at the center of the conversation about the clean energy transition. And that is not something that we have seen, frankly, in the past from climate activists or advocates of climate change who, you know, regrettably often like to say things like, well, there are more people who work in the solar industry than who work in coal. That doesn't help the conversation at all. And those are very different kinds of jobs. And I think the government, both government and clean energy companies, frankly, have important roles to play in making sure that jobs in the emerging economy are family-sustaining jobs with good pay, with good benefits. And the reason the government has an important role to play in this is if you look to the European Union, jobs in offshore wind, jobs in utility-scale renewable energy are heavily unionized. They're very well paid. They're highly skilled jobs. And the reason is because, frankly, of national industrial policies in those countries. And that is a place where we have been, frankly, neglectful in the United States, where things have gone in the wrong direction over many, many decades, and where I think now we have an opportunity to turn the ship around.
You want to come in, please?
Yeah. So I will say I agree wholeheartedly with Kristina or Ms. Costa, and I'm really glad that Congressman Curbelo mentioned people not being expendable. Obviously, as a black woman, I'm from a group that has often been considered collateral damage for policy. And I mean, I have a Rhodes Scholarship, and I know myself and tons of people who still live with the legacies of those choices. And so I honestly think that even if we get to net zero, in terms of emissions, and our economy is just as stratified as it is now, we have failed. There is really no reason. And so I do think that in terms of a just transition, the way that I see the role of government is two things. One is making sure that justice and equity is a metric and a consideration in the design of all policies related to the transition to a green economy. And then the second is that I think there is also room in terms of investment, because regardless of, that's why I think it's so funny to talk about whether there are bipartisan solutions, because I think obviously that is the ideal, but climate change does not care if you're a Republican or a Democrat. It just doesn't, right? And so I think that there is, it's coming. It's going to take massive investments to deal with, because it is throughout our economy, right? And we have to turn that around. And so I think that it's worth thinking about, when we're making those investments, how do we do that in ways that also reduce the legacy of, or the consequences of other policies that have considered people collateral damage, right? So if you're going to invest, how do you do it in ways that brings jobs to dispossessed areas? How do you do it in ways that close the racial wealth gap, right? How do you do it in ways that secure retirement for women, right? Which we know is still a huge issue. And making sure that, in addition to making it something within all the policies, that there's also some thought to targeted policies that fit within those investments.
So, Rhiana, you have elegantly bridged us to the first of our Twitter questions.
Oh, you're so welcome.
So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Before I state that question, let me set up the audience question and answer for those of you who are here in the hall. If you want to pose a question, when we come to that, please stick your hand up. We'll have a microphone come to you, thanks to our colleague Patrick. Please state your name, state your affiliation, and please a crisp question. No filibusters, please. The first of the questions that came from Twitter said the following: my paraphrasing of it. The panel has emphasized the importance of economic efficiency as a key criterion for effective climate policy. But besides economic efficiency, isn't there an importance in looking to other parameters as well, such as equity, political feasibility, social acceptability, and others? I'd like to throw that one to the panel. In a way, I think, Rhiana, I interpret your last comment as very strongly underscoring the need. You said metrics must include justice and equity. Others, you or others, anybody on the panel want to come in on that, please?
So I would just reiterate, and again, in the design of the Market Choice Act, we thought through as much as possible how we could protect lower income Americans, especially from any inequities that could result as a result of this legislation. I think we have to be mindful of the fact that we're trying to solve a major issue with climate change. We're trying to literally save the planet for future generations. That's already going to require a very ambitious piece of legislation that I hope will become law in the coming years. The more ambitious we get, and I lived through immigration wars in Congress where we tried to build compromises to move forward on the issue, the more ambitious we get, the less likely it is that we're going to get any result. So I think it's wonderful to have many goals when it comes to what we'd like to see from our government. To think that we're going to have one piece of legislation that covers it all, there's nothing wrong with aspiring toward that, but at the end of the day, we have to realize that already, just if we were exclusively dealing with the issue of climate change and not discussing anything else, which, to be fair, none of these bills do, because the Market Choice Act invests in American infrastructure. There are other carbon pricing bills that return all of the revenues in the form of a dividend to citizens. These are broad bills, but I think the more we try to grow them, and I can say this from 4 years of experience in legislating, the less likely is that we get any result at all. So I just a word of caution.
Please.
And can I add, so the pursuit of efficiency is for a bigger purpose than efficiency for its own sake. Mm-hmm. It's to reduce the cost of whatever it is that we're going to do to the economy to achieve our climate goals. Because when we talk about things like equity and distribution across the economy, if to the extent that we can minimize the cost, we're minimizing the burden that has to be distributed across the economy. So if we can do something at half the cost of a regulatory regime, for example, I would suggest, all of a sudden the political agreement necessary to put that together is easier. So it's efficiency in pursuit of our climate objectives and the political currency necessary to put an agreement together.
I think at the end of the day, solving climate change is about getting the most tons out of the system as quickly as possible. And there are places that market mechanisms work well for that, and there are places that we know from just the history of energy policy in this country, there are going to be market failures. And where, frankly, some of Columbia's own work on carbon pricing says, well, it doesn't necessarily do that much to reduce demand for oil and transportation, so a set of other policies are going to be necessary to get the tons out of that part of the system. And I think to Rhiana's very good point, when we look at the history of energy policy in this country, the places that the government has been most active are the places where there have been market failures. Look to the Rural Electrification Act and the original New Deal as opposed to the Green New Deal. The wires weren't going out there, so the federal government had to string them out and install the generation. And I think, that dynamic hasn't changed in a lot of ways. And I think it's important that we look at the whole system, which I think this panel is doing quite a good job of trying to do.
I will say, I will respectfully disagree and say I think that ambition is key, right? I think, I mean, I've not been in Congress, obviously.
Not yet.
Not yet. Not yet. She's smart.
Thank you, next.
Rhiana
But
2020.
but back to your answer.
Yes, but back to my answer. But I think there's a reason that the Green New Deal is capturing an imagination and excitement in ways that other climate policies have not, right? And I will say that politicians respond to their constituencies. Public interest creates, and public pressure. Public interest creates public pressure. And I think that to tackle climate change, because it is such a big thing, you have to get people to acknowledge it as a real threat, right? And acknowledge that it is urgent. And then to move and to be interested in moving because they see that even though there will be a change, there will be a transition, there is a better life for them on the other side. And I think that that is an essential story to tell to move any piece of climate legislation. And I think right now, beyond the fact that I think we have to solve so many crises that are connected to climate change, I think another just ambition is really necessary just to capture people's hearts, which is so necessary. I will say I didn't get involved in climate policy until recently. I worked on poverty, and climate just seemed like a very white issue.
Okay. I'm going to open up for questions, and I want to first, actually, Patrick, if you don't mind, I'd like, okay, please, name, affiliation, question.
I'm Bill Chapman.
And
I'm
really short.
I'm from the New York Conservative Climate Activist Group. I'm actually calling about the Green New Deal. I read Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's document, and there was no thought of bipartisanship in this thing. There are like a half a dozen things in it that have nothing to do with the environment, let
Sir, I'm
alone
going to ask you
climate
to
change.
pose a question here, okay?
Will the Green New Deal contain things like a job guarantee to anyone who wants one without having to move to where there's useful work to be done? Will it include a universal basic income? Will it include universal health care? Will it include labor unions have to take a leadership role?
Okay, great. I'm sorry, I'm going to kind of push the tempo here because otherwise we won't have enough time. Right up here in front, please, Patrick. Okay, right here.
Thank you for this panel. I'm John Goldberg. I run an investment firm focused on energy. My understanding of the carbon tax is you increase the tax, increase the price to dissuade use of it. Why would you finance that in part, understanding the somewhat regressive nature of it, with a cut in a gasoline tax, which would in theory lead to higher gasoline consumption?
So the purpose of, and by the way, this is just one design, and the purpose of eliminating the gas tax is, number one, to protect the most vulnerable Americans, right? The less income you have, the more sensitive you are to increases in the gas tax, assuming you drive a vehicle. And number two, part of the calculus was political in nature. How do we make this palatable, viable, so that both Republicans and Democrats can support it, so that potentially a Republican White House would sign it? We all know that Americans, for better or worse, are obsessed with gasoline prices. It's always on the front page. It oftentimes is the leading story on the major networks. If gas prices go up, if they drop, it's a big deal. I think that an easy way to attack carbon pricing legislation is to say that it's going to have a dramatic effect at the pump and really hurt Americans. I think that's one of the first things opponents will do to try to defeat it, and we wanted to mitigate against that. So for two reasons. One, a legitimate policy reason. The gasoline tax is a regressive tax, so we wanted to eliminate it. And by the way, it's a tax equity question too, because, for example, people driving around Teslas don't contribute to the Highway Trust Fund today, and this would ensure that they do, because we fund the Highway Trust Fund from revenues generated by a carbon tax. And then there was a political calculus as well. We wanted to protect the bill from what I think is an easy and obvious attack.
Rhiana Gunn-Wright, I think the short version of that question is the New Deal side of Green New Deal.
Will it include it? Yes. I mean, there are considerations about obviously how to structure a job guarantee, and we can get into the details. Happy to talk about those. But in short, yes. And I think for what you considered like no attention to bipartisanship, I don't think that's on purpose, but the fact is our first concern is solving the problem. And we define the problem as more broadly than climate change, not political feasibility. If people want to get on board, they can get on board. If they don't, then they don't.
Okay, we're gonna take 2 or 3 questions each time. Ma'am, please name, affiliation, and question.
Judith Weiss, environmental biologist at Rutgers. The latest report that's come out has said we've got about 12 years to get our act together, or else this is going to be a really horrible world for our grandchildren.
Yeah.
I have grandchildren. And I also think I'm happy the Republicans are beginning to admit it, but these are conversations that should have happened a long time ago.
Question, please.
Yes. How soon can the new innovations and the R&D that are being encouraged, how soon can that find its way into being functional, given the 12 years that they're saying?
Okay, this woman right here in the front, please. And then I'm looking, when I look around, please stick your hand up if you want to ask questions, so please.
I'm Eleanor Batchelder. I'm a citizen.
That's a good affiliation.
Most important role.
Do you think there's a role for state and local governments in all of this?
Yes.
Okay, and I saw a hand right here on the aisle, and then we're going to go to the back a bit.
I have a quick question for Rhiana and one for the Congressman. Rhiana, first, thanks for everything you've done on this. And is there any way that you can explain a little bit better how new consensus is going to help with getting the legislation? Are you all writing it for AOC? What's the process, or are you going to do something separate that she'll borrow from? Okay, and thank you. And then, Congressman, thank you for your leadership too. And on terms of getting additional Republicans on board, you know, a lot of Republicans don't want to touch this because they tell you all the time they're going to get primaried if they do. And there's members of your Climate Solutions Caucus who are great, who have recently reiterated that even if they don't have a primary worry, they're extremely worried by the attacks of Grover Norquist every time they put their toe in the water that go all over the Hill. And those are really serious concerns that we're hearing from members. And I was just wondering what your thinking is on how to get on the other side of those gigantic issues.
Great. Okay, so we have, when will we see results from R&D, given that we have 12 years or a horrible future for grandchildren that I hope to have some of at some point. Don't tell my kids. Second, role of state and local policymaking. Third, what is the specific role of new consensus? And fourth, how to get more Republicans on board. Do you want to start with the R&D question, Alex? And as many of the other ones as you can do in rapid fire.
Oh, I'm only going to do the first one. I think it's going to take more than 12 years. And I think we're going to have to mitigate, and I think we're going to have to adapt. And I particularly believe that when I see global energy consumption patterns. Yeah. And I say that only to tell you that I share your concern about the scale of the problem. But I don't, period.
Okay, good. State and local.
I'll do some state and local. So yes, there is a very important role for state and local governments to play in this, in combating climate change. We're seeing a lot of that now, frankly, as a result of President Trump's election and his decision to announce his intent to withdraw the U.S. from Paris. You know, California, New York State are huge leaders, but so are places like Michigan. So are quite a lot of cities, frankly, in so-called red states, places like Houston, places like Miami, as the congressman was talking about. And I think the fact of the matter is, and you're seeing, frankly, I think more bipartisan concrete action at the state and local level because it's right on elected officials' doorsteps, and they cannot ignore it the way that sometimes we can in Washington because, frankly, we have quite good air conditioning, so even when it's very hot, we don't notice that much. We just stay inside like mole people. A point was made on this panel that I think is a very good one, which is politicians respond to their constituencies. And so that constituent pressure is, frankly, essential at all levels of government, and, frankly, at the corporate level as well, which you're seeing very interesting things with shareholders and with customers.
Rhiana, please.
Yeah, so +1 to what Kristina says, states and locals have led in absence of some leadership from the federal government, particularly since the end of the Obama administration, and we've pulled on local and state policy too in our research. The exact role of New Consensus. So New Consensus is working on a plan through a collective process. So that's also why you don't see us out saying a bunch of things, because we think that policy is collective solutions to collective problems, and so we're in the process of building our collective. But we will be outside. Our plan will be an outside plan. We are not directly writing her legislation.
Okay, please, the gentleman in the back.
Hi, Isuru Sen. Sorry, Isuru Sen, energy investor, and I volunteer with Citizens Climate Lobby. Two questions on, or one question on the dividend. You talked a lot about carbon taxes, which are regressive, so we've seen the riots in Paris. But there's not, it seems like there's not enough discussion on the dividends, which completely turns the discussion on its head by giving people money and being supremely progressive. So a question for the congressman, how do you win Republican support over by making this market-based solution apparent, or it's a marketing question? And then for Rhiana, the question is, why not embrace dividends as a supremely progressive means to reward the carbon virtuous?
Okay, and I apologize, I didn't let you answer the last question,
well,
so please
it's good
jump in.
because they're related. So what moves Republicans, at least my experience during 4 years, number one, it's education. It's a lot of one-on-one conversations. It means people like all of you in this room going to the Hill, visiting, especially if you have a Republican member of Congress. Probably not the case if you're from around here, but certainly you have relatives in other parts of the country that should reach out to their members. A lot of one-on-one conversations. I know Alex Flint does this, Jeff Williams does this. I will do this when I can after 1 year. And then the other factor that's really helping is that as younger generation Republicans, meaning people my age or younger, start moving into the Congress, those members are less afraid of this issue, are more willing to take risk. They're younger, so they understand it better. And they will be more likely to support the kind of solution we need.
So in the very back row, right in front of the camera there, please.
Thanks. My name's Edwin Atkins. I worked and I studied here at the Earth Institute in carbon capture and sequestration and energy and development. Quick observation, then a question. The observation is, as someone who's looked at this from a scientific and engineering side, I think decade after decade, the consistent feature of this has been, of this debate, is that responses are not anywhere near what is quantitatively realistic to solve the problem. And we're off by orders of magnitude here. So my question is, where is, because you guys have insight into the business world, into the policy world, and I think this is partly what the woman who is asking the 12-year question are getting at. Sure, there's now, belated recognition that this is a real thing. But where does the debate stand in terms of what are quantitatively realistic measures to address this? In anything short of putting something on a 100-year time frame is not necessarily solving the problem. So where does the debate stand? Is it at the state level? Is it at the federal level where people see this?
Okay, and I apologize. We're going to have that be the last question. And I'd like the panelists, please, to come back, address that question, and then any parting shots that you have in the couple of minute and a half that we have remaining. Who wants to kick off?
Okay, I'll start. I truly believe that we need a federal solution to address this challenge, which is really a global solution. And the way we guarantee that in the sense of carbon pricing is through border adjustments. We essentially control access to our economy depending on whether other countries are taking into account the price of carbon or not. And within 2 or 3 years, I think the border adjustment component of carbon pricing will be irrelevant because the rest of the world, at least the major economies of the world, will follow. I don't think they'll have a choice. Here's a closing thought. I think a lot of people are worried that this emergence of the Green New Deal threatens the likelihood of there to be a bipartisan agreement. I'm optimistic for a few reasons. Number one, the Green New Deal, whether, and I understand people can't really support it or oppose it yet because it hasn't been defined yet, but whether you end up supporting it or opposing it, you should recognize that it is bringing a lot of welcome attention to this issue, and it's forcing the conversation across the political spectrum. That is wonderful, and those who are out there promoting it should be commended for elevating the issue. Number two, it's going to shift the political spectrum, meaning it's going to give Republicans and conservatives something to oppose, which they enjoy. Very, very good at opposing things. It's the nature of a conservative party. And number two, it's going to, I believe, force them to pivot to a solution that they can live with. And that's the beginning of a negotiation. We're against X, but we think we can work with you on Y. And that's how I think we get to a solution here in the next 2 to 5 years, hopefully.
Great, thank you. Kristina, please.
Sure. So, I mean, I think the reality is that there is no one solution that's equal to the scale of the challenge because quite literally there is no one solution that's equal to the scale of the challenge. Different parts of the economy are going to respond to different kinds of policy interventions more efficiently or less efficiently. And I think to add to the speed, scale, durability conversation that we've been having, there's a fourth element, frankly, which is increasing ambition over time as new technologies develop, as political will increases, as we learn more, frankly, about what works and what doesn't in some of the stickier parts of the economy. And that is a feature, that is built into market mechanisms like carbon pricing. It's a feature that, frankly, is built into the Paris Climate Agreement. And I think it is an essential part of this conversation. It's not like we can pass the Green New Deal tomorrow and we're done with climate change. We solved it. That's not how this works.
I'll answer the question that I was posed really quickly. A dividend is an important part of a carbon tax. I don't think that we would consider something without it. The issue is that a dividend, there's a couple of questions. Number one for us is delivery. How do you deliver it in a way that is timely, because a lot of people cannot deal with price increases. So without higher wages, you need to be sort of delivering that money back to them as close to real time as you can. And so that's one of the issues with dividends, and thinking about how you design that out and structure that so that can happen. And then the second, I don't think I'm interested in it, in solutions that don't meet the scale of the problem. I agree with Kristina, though, that no one solution is the key, which is why you see us going farther than a carbon tax, because a carbon tax alone will not save us.
Alex, parting shots.
Lots of great comments this evening. I appreciate being here. I think as a closing comment, I will say on this day when the evolution of Republicans' views on the science of climate change is becoming more public, I think the corollary is there needs to, on the left, be an evolution in the view of the economics of addressing climate change. To reach some agreement, we're going to have Republicans recognize the science and the necessity to act, and we're going to have the left recognize the economic consequences of action for there to be an agreement at some point in the future, if it is going to be durable and if it's going to be at the scale necessary to address the problem.
Well, with that, let me do a momentary public service announcement of a couple of upcoming programs that we are hosting here at the Center on Global Energy Policy. On February 18th, at this same time frame, 6 p.m., in Low Library, we will have an event that will focus on a brand new report just released yesterday on electric vehicle charging in China and the United States. Our colleague David Sandelow, who is or was in the back, is one of the co-authors with Anders Hove. He will be joined for that program by Shirley Tung from State Grid of China, Kevin Tu, who is a fellow with the Center on Global Energy Policy and the former program manager for China at the International Energy Agency, and Sheng Yan, another fellow from our center. Then on February 20th, we will have a book launch of Escaping the Energy Poverty Trap, When and How Governments Power the Lives of the Poor. This will be February 20th at 6 p.m. Johannes Erpelainen, who is one of our non-resident fellows and is the director of the Institute for Sustainable Energy Policy at Johns Hopkins SAIS, is one of the co-authors. He will be joined by Michelle Keene from the World Bank and our colleague Philippe Benoit, who will moderate. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our speaker and panelists for a fabulous, fabulous discussion.